It all started with the sound of an envelope being dropped into the mailbox. A plain white letter, stamped with the official HOA logo, lay inside. At first, it seemed like routine correspondence, reminders about lawn care, trash pickup schedules, or upcoming meetings. But as the homeowner unfolded the paper, the bold red letters jumped out immediately. It was a complaint. Not just any complaint, but one directly accusing their dog of being the source of unhygienic messes around the neighborhood. The accusation didn't come as a total surprise. For weeks there had been whispers from the woman down the street, the one everyone quietly referred to as a Karen. She was known for her sharp eyes, quick judgments, and endless letters to the HOA. The target this time was the family dog, a gentle, aging golden retriever who spent most of his days sleeping by the front porch. The claim in the letter was simple, yet infuriating. The dog was supposedly wandering freely, leaving messes on lawns, and disrupting the neighborhood's standards of cleanliness. At first, the homeowner brushed it off as another baseless attack. After all, the dog was always walked on a leash, supervised, and never allowed to roam unsupervised. But Karen's persistence grew louder. Neighbors began mentioning that she had approached them, pointing fingers, claiming she had seen it with her own eyes. She insisted that the dog was the culprit behind every pile of mess spotted along the sidewalks. And with every retelling, her conviction seemed to grow stronger. The HOA letter wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Within days, a second notice arrived, this time hinting at fines if the situation was not addressed immediately. It carried the same threatening tone, citing community bylaws and sanitation rules. By now, the homeowner realized Karen wasn't just spreading rumors. She was formally reporting them, forcing the HOA to act on her claims. Meanwhile, the golden retriever remained blissfully unaware of the drama swirling around him. He greeted the mailman with a wagging tail, napped under the shade tree in the yard, and trotted happily during evening walks. His innocence was obvious to his family, but that didn't matter to Karen. To her, every corner of the block became evidence, every scrap of dirt was suspicious, and every neighbor who disagreed was simply blind to the problem. The situation quickly became exhausting. Other neighbors began murmuring about the accusations. Some believed Karen, recalling her claims of seeing the dog wandering. Others defended the family, pointing out the retriever's calm nature and the lack of any real proof. The street felt divided, and tension hung heavy in the air. Then came the moment that pushed everything over the edge. One morning, another letter arrived. This time, it wasn't just a warning. It was a fine. The HOA, pressured by repeated complaints, had officially charged the homeowner with violating community rules. The amount wasn't astronomical, but it was insulting. Paying it would mean admitting guilt for something that never happened. Refusing it meant a drawn-out fight with the HOA. Frustration mounted. The homeowner realized that without evidence, it would always be their word against Karen's. And Karen wasn't slowing down. She was emboldened by the HOA's actions, walking around the neighborhood with a smug expression, telling anyone who would listen that she was protecting the community. It became clear that words alone wouldn't fix this. Something more concrete was needed. Proof. Solid, undeniable proof that the dog was innocent. That was when the idea formed. A solution so simple, yet so effective. Security cameras. If Karen wanted to play the role of detective, it was time to bring in real evidence. By the end of that week, small but powerful cameras were installed around the property. Discreet, motion-activated, and angled perfectly to cover both the yard and the street in front. The homeowner didn't announce it. They didn't argue with Karen or the HOA. Instead, they waited silently, knowing the truth would eventually reveal itself. What they didn't expect, however, was just how shocking that truth would be. And with the cameras quietly recording, the stage was set for a revelation that would shake the entire neighborhood. The cameras had been in place for only a few days when the first recording arrived. The homeowner had set them to send motion-triggered clips directly to their phone, and most of the footage was mundane. Passing cars, neighbors walking their children to school, the golden retriever dozing peacefully on the porch. Nothing unusual. Nothing that proved anything one way or the other. But patience was part of the plan. If Karen was so determined to blame the dog, then whatever she was referencing would eventually show up on camera. So, each day, the homeowner reviewed the clips. Most evenings it felt repetitive, yet oddly satisfying, to confirm that the retriever never strayed beyond the yard without a leash. It was clear evidence of innocence, just not yet the kind that could silence Karen. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning. The dog was napping, as usual, when the motion sensor triggered. On screen appeared a familiar figure. Karen herself. Dressed in her typical walking outfit, clutching her phone tightly, she strolled into view. But she wasn't alone. Trailing just behind her was a small dog, clearly not leashed, darting freely along the sidewalk. The little creature stopped near the retriever's yard, sniffed, circled, and then, unmistakably, left a mess right in plain sight. Karen paused, glanced around, then tugged the small dog along, pretending not to notice. She didn't pick up after it. She didn't even hesitate. She simply walked away. The homeowner replayed the clip several times, stunned by what they were seeing. The culprit wasn't the retriever. It was Karen's own dog. And not only that, she had deliberately ignored her responsibility, leaving behind exactly the kind of mess she had accused the neighbor's dog of making. The hypocrisy was staggering. Over the next few days, more recordings followed. Each one painted the same picture. Karen walking her dog without a leash, allowing it to wander onto other people's lawns, and leaving behind the evidence she later pinned on the retriever. She seemed almost strategic, timing her walks early in the morning or late in the evening when she thought no one was watching. But the cameras were always watching now, and the digital collection of evidence grew stronger by the day. The homeowner didn't rush to share the footage. They wanted a clear, undeniable pattern before bringing it forward. One recording could be dismissed as coincidence, but 5, 10, that would be impossible to ignore. And so, the days turned into weeks, and the folder of clips swelled with undeniable proof. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior only grew bolder. She filed another complaint with the HOA, claiming that the retriever had once again roamed freely. She cornered neighbors on the sidewalk, insisting that they should all petition for stricter leash enforcement. She even went as far as to suggest that the retriever was dangerous, despite being one of the gentlest animals in the community. What Karen didn't know was that every time she doubled down on her accusations, she was digging herself deeper into a hole that would soon collapse around her. The homeowner was patient, calm, and deliberate. They knew the right moment to strike would come. The tension reached a peak one weekend when Karen stormed up to the homeowner's driveway during a family gathering. Without hesitation, she began loudly announcing that the HOA was preparing harsh fines and that the retriever was on probation. Neighbors turned their heads at the commotion. Some looked sympathetic, others skeptical, but Karen's voice carried across the street with righteous fury. It was then that the homeowner realized the time had come. The evidence was ready. The story needed to be told, not with words or denials, but with cold, hard proof. The cameras had captured everything, and once that proof was shared, Karen's reign of false accusations would crumble. That night, the homeowner carefully organized the files into a neat presentation. Clip after clip was labeled with dates and times, forming a timeline that could not be disputed. The plan was clear. Bring it to the HOA first. Force them to see the truth. Then, if Karen still refused to back down, share it with the neighbors who had been caught in the middle of her crusade. As the folder of evidence sat ready to be unleashed, one thought lingered. Karen had spent weeks building her case on lies and intimidation, But soon the entire neighborhood would see her for who she really was. The stage was set. The truth was loaded and waiting. And once revealed, there would be no going back. The monthly HOA meeting was usually uneventful. A handful of residents gathered in the community center, sipping lukewarm coffee as board members shuffled papers and discussed budgets, landscaping schedules, and the occasional reminder about trash bins. But on this particular evening, the air felt heavier. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew that complaints about the golden retriever had been building, and whispers about Karen's relentless campaign had spread across the neighborhood. The homeowner arrived early, a folder tucked under their arm. Inside it were neatly labeled USB drives, printed screenshots, and a carefully written statement. Every detail was prepared. The time for silence had ended. Tonight, the truth would be revealed. Karen was already there, sitting near the front with her arms crossed tightly across her chest. She radiated confidence, the kind born of weeks of believing she had the upper hand. Her small dog was absent, but her smug expression suggested she felt victory was already hers. She greeted neighbors with pointed comments, making sure to remind them of her version of the dog problem. To the board members, she offered a look of self-satisfaction, as if she expected them to thank her for her vigilance. When the meeting began, routine matters came first. Financial reports, neighborhood updates, and announcements about upcoming events were covered quickly. Then came the familiar agenda item, community concerns. The chair opened the floor, and as expected, Karen's hand shot up immediately. She stood, straightened her posture, and launched into her well-rehearsed speech. She spoke of ongoing sanitation issues, of irresponsible pet ownership, and of repeated violations that she claimed were damaging the community's image. Her words were polished, her tone sharp. She painted the retriever as a menace, roaming unchecked and leaving behind constant messes. She demanded stricter enforcement and harsher fines, even hinting at removing the dog from the neighborhood entirely. Some board members nodded along, clearly weary of the ongoing complaints. Others looked uncertain, glancing toward the homeowner as if to weigh both sides. Karen spoke with such conviction that for a moment it seemed she might sway the room again. But then the homeowner rose. Calmly, without raising their voice, they approached the front. They placed the folder on the table, sliding it toward the board members. They didn't need dramatic words or heated rebuttals. Instead, they simply explained that new evidence had been collected. Clear, undeniable footage. With a small nod, they gestured for the first clip to be played on the projector that the HOA used for presentations. The room went silent as the footage began. On screen, Karen appeared, walking her small D down the sidewalk. At first, there was nothing unusual. Then the dog darted onto a neighbor's lawn, sniffed, and left a mess. Karen glanced around, tugged the leash she wasn't even holding properly, and walked away without cleaning up. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some residents covered their mouths. Others exchanged looks of disbelief. The next clip played. Then another. Each one showed the same pattern. Karen's dog running freely, leaving behind the mess, and Karen ignoring it completely. The retriever, meanwhile, was never seen leaving the yard unsupervised. Clip after clip dismantled her story piece by piece, stripping away every ounce of credibility she had built. By the fourth video, Karen's face had turned crimson. She shifted in her seat, stammered faintly, and tried to mutter about coincidences and misunderstandings. But the evidence was overwhelming. There was no room left for excuses. The neighbors who had once nodded politely at her accusations now turned their eyes on her with something between anger and disgust. The board members, too, were visibly shaken. Their earlier willingness to consider harsher fines melted into embarrassment. They had acted on Karen's words without proof, and now it was clear they had been manipulated. The chair cleared his throat awkwardly, announcing that all previous fines against the retriever's owner would be dismissed immediately. Not only that, but the board would issue a formal warning to Karen for repeated false claims, and failure to follow community rules regarding pets. Karen tried to protest, but her words fell flat. No one wanted to hear them anymore. Her credibility was shattered. The evidence spoke louder than anything she could say. As the homeowner gathered their folder, the room filled with a quiet sense of vindication. Neighbors whispered congratulations, some even apologizing for having doubted the retriever. The board moved swiftly to the next agenda item, clearly eager to move past the spectacle, but the damage to Karen's reputation was irreversible. By the end of the meeting, one thing was clear. The tide had turned. Karen was no longer the enforcer of neighborhood order. She was the exposed liar, the hypocrite whose obsession with control had finally caught up to her. But as satisfying as the confrontation was, the story wasn't finished yet. Because while Karen had been publicly humiliated, she wasn't the type to retreat quietly. And in the days that followed, her resentment began to boil into something far more unpredictable. The fallout from the HOA meeting spread across the neighborhood like wildfire. Within hours, whispers turned into conversations, and conversations turned into judgments. Karen's name, once tied to authority and vigilance, was now synonymous with deceit. Residents who had once nodded along with her crusade began avoiding her on the sidewalk. The humiliation of being exposed publicly, her own dog caught in the act, lingered in every sideways glance and hushed chuckle. But Karen was not the type to bow her head and move on. She thrived on control, and losing it burned her pride more than any fine or reprimand could. That humiliation quickly fermented into anger, and that anger transformed into schemes. Her first attempt at revenge was subtle. Within days of the meeting, anonymous complaints began landing in the HOA inbox. They weren't about dogs this time. They were about noise, about weeds in gardens, about supposed violations of mailbox decorations. Each one was vague, unsigned, but clearly targeting the same homeowner who had exposed her. It didn't take a detective to guess who was behind them. The HOA, however, was cautious now. Having been embarrassed once, the board was unwilling to act on baseless claims again. They dismissed the anonymous notes, filing them away without consequence. Still, Karen kept sending them, convinced that persistence would wear down the board's patience. When that failed, she escalated. One evening, the homeowner found a small pile of trash scattered across their driveway. An odd assortment of crumpled paper, plastic wrappers, and half-eaten food. At first, it seemed like an accident, maybe wind-blown debris. But when it happened again the very next night, with different trash, the pattern became clear. Someone was deliberately placing it there. The security cameras, ever watchful, captured a shadowy figure approaching at dusk, tossing the garbage carelessly before scurrying away. The blurry outline was unmistakable. It was Karen. The homeowner didn't confront her immediately. Instead, they saved the footage, adding it to the growing collection of evidence. They had learned that patience was the most powerful weapon against her impulsive spite. But Karen wasn't done. A week later, a letter appeared taped to the homeowner's front door. Written in jagged handwriting, it accused them of endangering the neighborhood and harassing residents. The note demanded they leave the community if they couldn't follow the rules. It wasn't signed, but its tone, its choice of words, carried Karen's voice in every line. The intimidation tactics didn't stop there. Karen began spreading rumors again, only this time the whispers were darker. She claimed the homeowner was using the cameras to spy on neighbors, invading privacy, collecting footage for malicious purposes. It was a desperate attempt to shift suspicion away from herself and to reframe the narrative. But the neighbors weren't convinced. They had seen the footage at the HOA meeting. They knew who had been lying, and with every new rumor Karen tried to plant, her reputation sank deeper. Parents who once let their children play near her yard now steered them away. Conversations would stop when she approached. Her isolation was becoming visible. Still, she refused to let go. She seemed determined to claw back control, even if it meant spiraling further into vindictive behavior. And each attempt only gave the homeowner more evidence of her obsession. The turning point came one night when the cameras caught something far more serious. At nearly midnight, Karen appeared again, this time not with trash but with a small bottle in her hand. She crouched near the homeowner's flower bed, pouring some kind of liquid onto the soil before darting back into the shadows. By morning, the once vibrant flowers had begun to wilt, their leaves curling unnaturally. It was sabotage. Not petty complaints, not rumors, but deliberate damage to property. And this time, it was caught on camera in perfect clarity. The homeowner realized the situation had escalated beyond simple neighborhood drama. This was no longer about petty complaints or false accusations. This was harassment. It was targeted, deliberate, and relentless. The decision was made that evening. The footage would not stay private any longer. It wouldn't just go to the HOA this time. It would go further, to the authorities if necessary. And perhaps most importantly, to the neighbors themselves. If Karen wanted to keep escalating, the only solution was to expose her again, this time in a way she couldn't escape. What Karen didn't realize was that her attempts at revenge had only set the stage for her downfall. The homeowner was ready, the evidence was irrefutable, and the neighborhood was already losing patience with her. And soon, everyone would see just how far she had gone. The fallout from the HOA meeting spread across the neighborhood like wildfire. Within hours, whispers turned into conversations, and conversations turned into judgments. Karen's name, once tied to authority and vigilance, was now synonymous with deceit. Residents who had once nodded along with her crusade began avoiding her on the sidewalk. The humiliation of being exposed publicly, her own dog caught in the act, lingered in every sideways glance and hushed, chuckle. But Karen was not the type to bow her head and move on. She thrived on control, and losing it burned her pride more than any fine or reprimand could. That humiliation quickly fermented into anger, and that anger transformed into schemes. Her first attempt at revenge was subtle. Within days of the meeting, anonymous complaints began landing in the HOA inbox. They weren't about dogs this time. They were about noise, about weeds in gardens, about supposed violations of mailbox decorations. Each one was vague, unsigned, but clearly targeting the same homeowner who had exposed her. It didn't take a detective to guess who was behind them. The HOA, however, was cautious now. Having been embarrassed once, the board was unwilling to act on baseless claims again. They dismissed the anonymous notes, filing them away without consequence. Still, Karen kept sending them, convinced that persistence would wear down the board's patience. When that failed, she escalated. One evening, the homeowner found a small pile of trash scattered across their driveway, an odd assortment of crumpled paper, plastic wrappers, and half-eaten food. At first, it seemed like an accident, maybe wind-blown debris, but when it happened again the very next night with different trash, the pattern became clear. Someone was deliberately placing it there. The security cameras, ever watchful, captured a shadowy figure approaching at dusk, tossing the garbage carelessly before scurrying away. The blurry outline was unmistakable. It was Karen. The homeowner didn't confront her immediately. Instead, they saved the footage, adding it to the growing collection of evidence. They had learned that patience was the most powerful weapon against her impulsive spite. But Karen wasn't done. A week later, a letter appeared taped to the homeowner's front door. Written in jagged handwriting, it accused them of endangering the neighborhood and harassing residents. The note demanded they leave the community if they couldn't follow the rules. It wasn't signed, but its tone, its choice of words, carried Karen's voice in every line. The intimidation tactics didn't stop there. Karen began spreading rumors again, only this time the whispers were darker. She claimed the homeowner was using the cameras to spy on neighbors, invading privacy, collecting footage for malicious purposes. It was a desperate attempt to shift suspicion away from herself and to reframe the narrative. But the neighbors weren't convinced. They had seen the footage at the HOA meeting. They knew who had been lying. And with every new rumor Karen tried to plant, her reputation sank deeper. Parents who once let their children play near her yard now steered them away. Conversations would stop when she approached. Her isolation was becoming visible. Still, she refused to let go. She seemed determined to claw back control, even if it meant spiraling further into vindictive behavior. And each attempt only gave the homeowner more evidence of her obsession. The turning point came one night when the cameras caught something far more serious. At nearly midnight, Karen appeared again, this time not with trash, but with a small bottle in her hand. She crouched near the homeowner's flower bed, pouring some kind of liquid onto the soil before darting back into the shadows. By morning, the once vibrant flowers had begun to wilt, their leaves curling unnaturally. It was sabotage, not petty complaints, not rumors, but deliberate damage to property. And this time, it was caught on camera in perfect clarity. The homeowner realized the situation had escalated beyond simple neighborhood drama. This was no longer about petty complaints or false accusations. This was harassment. It was targeted, deliberate, and relentless. The decision was made that evening. The footage would not stay private any longer. It wouldn't just go to the HOA this time. It would go there, to the authorities if necessary, and, perhaps most importantly, to the neighbors themselves. If Karen wanted to keep escalating, the solution was to expose her again, this time in a way she couldn't escape. What Karen didn't realize was that her attempts at revenge had only set the stage for her downfall. The homeowner was ready, the evidence was irrefutable, and the neighborhood was already losing patience with her. And soon, everyone would see just how far she had gone. The morning after the sabotage was captured, the homeowner knew the situation had reached a breaking point. The flower bed was ruined, the soil poisoned, and the once colorful blooms drooped like silent victims of Karen's obsession. But the most important detail was the footage. Crystal clear, undeniable proof of her sneaking into the yard under cover of darkness and committing the act herself. This time, silence was no longer an option. The homeowner prepared the evidence and, instead of taking it privately to the HOA first, chose a different approach. They began quietly sharing the video with neighbors, one by one. Phones lit up with the footage, and each reaction was the same: shock, disbelief, and then anger. By noon, the story had spread across the block. Families whispered about it in driveways, retirees discussed it over morning coffee, and children even repeated fragments of the tale in hushed tones as if it were some ghost story. The collective mood shifted from mild annoyance with Karen to outright outrage. She had crossed a line. It wasn't long before the HOA board became aware as well. Residents began forwarding the footage to the members, demanding immediate action. The board, already embarrassed from their earlier mishandling of the false dog accusations, knew they couldn't afford another failure. They scheduled an emergency meeting, this time with the specific agenda of addressing Karen's behavior. When the notice went out, the entire neighborhood seemed to rally. People who had skipped routine meetings for years now howled up, eager to see justice. The community center filled quickly, the atmosphere buzzing with anticipation. Karen arrived late, clearly flustered, and walked into a room full of eyes that no longer carried respect or sympathy. The meeting began, and without delay, the footage was played for all to see. On the screen, there she was, creeping through the night, bottle in hand, committing the act. The clarity was damning. Gasps filled the room. Some residents shook their heads, others muttered under their breath. A woman in the back audibly whispered, "Unbelievable." Karen tried to object, raising her voice, claiming the video was doctored, insisting she was being framed. But the more she spoke, the less anyone believed her. Her words rang hollow against the weight of the images on the screen. Neighbors began to voice their frustrations openly. Parents accused her of creating a hostile environment. Retirees spoke of sleepless nights from her constant crusades. Even those who had once tolerated her rule-keeping persona now admitted they felt harassed and targeted. The floodgates opened, and years of pent-up resentment poured out in front of everyone. The HOA board listened quietly, their faces grim. When the room finally quieted, the chair announced their decision. Karen would be formally fined for property damage, banned from filing any further complaints for the next year, and placed under review for continued membership in the community. The possibility of legal action was also mentioned, depending on how she responded. The announcement was met with applause from the neighbors, a rare show of unity in a room usually filled with tension. For once, everyone seemed to agree. Karen's reign of control had ended. But the humiliation didn't stop there. Word of her sabotage spread beyond the meeting. Neighbors who once greeted her politely now turned away when she passed. Children mocked her behind her back. Families whispered as she walked by, their conversations suddenly cut short until she was gone. Her once commanding presence had become an object of ridicule. Even her small dog, once the unseen accomplice, seemed to symbolize her hypocrisy to everyone who watched her walk down the street. What had once been a tool for her false accusations now served as a reminder of the truth that had destroyed her credibility. Karen tried to fight back. She made half-hearted attempts to spin the narrative, telling anyone who would listen that the footage was fake, that she was being targeted by a conspiracy. But no one believed her anymore. The more she insisted, the more people laughed or walked away. The homeowner, meanwhile, felt a wave of relief. The community had seen the truth, and justice had been served, not just for them, but for the neighborhood as a whole. The golden retriever, innocent from the very beginning, once again napped peacefully in the yard, no longer the subject of whispered complaints. Still, there was a lingering question. Would Karen accept her defeat and retreat quietly? Or would she continue to spiral further, her pride refusing to let go of the power she once held? As the days turned into weeks, the answer became clear. Karen had lost her authority, her reputation, and the support of her neighbors. But in the shadows of her humiliation, she plotted one final act, a desperate attempt to claw back control, even as everything around her slipped away. Karen's silence after the explosive HOA meeting lasted only a few days. For a brief moment, it seemed as though she might finally retreat into the background, humbled by the overwhelming evidence and the community's rejection. But Karen's pride was not so easily buried. Her reputation had been shredded, her authority stripped away, and her control over the neighborhood dismantled. In her mind, there was still one chance left to reclaim some form of power. She began with whispers again, this time directed not at the homeowner, but at anyone who would still give her an E. Albeit she claimed she was the real victim, framed by manipulated footage. She accused the HOA of corruption, of conspiring with the homeowner to silence her. Yet where once her words carried weight, now they only deepened her isolation. Neighbors shook their heads and walked away. The more she spoke, the more pitiful she seemed. When rumors failed, she turned to action. Late one evening, the cameras caught her once again creeping along the sidewalk, clutching a stack of papers. By morning, dozens of anonymous flyers were taped to mailboxes across the neighborhood. They contained wild accusations, claims of spying, harassment, even criminal behavior. Each one was directed at the homeowner, dripping with venom and paranoia. But this time, her tactics had the opposite effect. Instead of rallying support, the flyers enraged the neighbors. One by one, residents tore them down. Some delivered the crumpled papers directly to the HOA office as evidence of harassment. Others marched up to Karen's door, demanding she stop immediately. Her desperate attempt to stir chaos had only made the community unite against her even more. The HOA board acted swiftly. A formal notice was delivered to Karen's home, citing violations of harassment, defamation, and community disturbance. Alongside the fines, the board announced they were pursuing legal action to remove her from the HOA entirely, a rare but not unprecedented step. It was the final straw. As the case moved forward, Karen's mask of superiority finally cracked. Neighbors saw her less and less, her once daily patrols of the block replaced by closed curtains and darkened windows. The small dog, once her constant companion, was now walked quickly at odd hours, her eyes avoiding every gaze. She had become a ghost in the very community she once ruled with fear and pettiness. When the official letter arrived, confirming her removal from the HOA and the loss of her privileges within the community, her downfall was complete. The duo, woman who had once dictated how people mowed their lawns, where they parked their cars, and even how they decorated their homes, now had no voice at all. The homeowner, at last, could breathe freely. The golden retriever returned to his peaceful routine, lounging in the sun and wagging his tail at passing neighbors who now stopped to pet him without hesitation. The tension that had hung over the block for months lifted like a heavy fog finally burned away by the morning sun. And though Karen remained a presence, a figure glimpsed only rarely behind her blinds, the neighborhood had moved on. They had seen her lies, her hypocrisy, and her malice. They had stood together against her, and they had won. The story of Karen became less a source of drama and more a cautionary tale, retold in driveways and at block parties. Neighbors would shake their heads, laugh, and remind each other of the time she tried to take down a dog and ended up destroying herself instead. In the end, Karen had hated the retriever so much that she built her downfall around him. But the truth, captured silently by the unblinking eye of a camera, had revealed her for what she truly was, and in doing so, it gave the neighborhood back its peace. The dog, as always, knew nothing of the chaos. To him, it was just another day, another nap in the sunshine, another evening walk with the people who loved him. For everyone else, however, it was a reminder that no matter how loud the lies, the truth always finds its way to the surface.